Okay, welcome. We're up to Parshas Vayeshev. We're learning from using this edition, the Chumash, and Parshas Vayeshev follows last week's Parshas Vishlach. We saw how this great battle, the struggle for who's going to set the direction for humanity, for God's vision for the world. God has the vision, but who's going to be in charge of bringing that vision to fruition in terms of, you need everyone's participation, but who's going to be making sure that the ship is going in the right direction. It's not, the energy is not getting dispersed into many different directions, getting distracted by the physicality of the world. And so that's the battle between Jacob and Esav. And last week we saw the tremendous meeting between the two of them after many, many years. And the refinement of Esav, which the Lubavitch Rebbe has now says that the refinement of Esav is completed. Already in those times, the refinement of Esav was sufficiently completed that Jacob was able to meet with Esav. But now, after thousands of years more, it's completely finished, and we are ready for the ultimate and complete redemption. And Esav himself is ready for the ultimate and complete redemption. And then we saw the influence that Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, she was a person who saw the world around her as a Jew is supposed to see the world around them as a opportunity to bring the world to the recognition of God Almighty. And because it says that because she her father didn't want her to become the wife of Esav, which she would have had the ability to correct Esav's direction, that he himself would have even more quickly come to the proper service of God Almighty. So as a consequence of that, hiding her from being able to better influence Esav, she became kidnapped and violated by Shechem. And we see that because the residents of Shechem did not protest, did not set up a court of justice to judge Shechem, because rape is a capital crime, and therefore she is something that he should have been executed for. Therefore, the entire community was culpable for not fulfilling the judgment, for not fulfilling God's command that justice be carried out in the world. And as a result, they themselves became culpable. And we know what happened over there, that two of Jacob's sons took matters into their own hands and executed the male residents of that town for not properly enforcing justice and not standing up, not protecting this girl who had been violated by one of the leaders of their community, and Shechem. And so we now find ourselves coming into the time when Jacob is now thinks he's done. He thinks that he's accomplished these tremendous things. He has survived and thrived in the most difficult adversarial situations. He fought with Lavan, his father-in-law, who tried to deceive him and tried to steal from him multiple times. And he succeeded there in maintaining his righteousness. And then with Esav, and then with Shechem, in the town of Shechem, that they tried to take his daughter. So he was now in this great sort of situation where it seemed everything was done. Everything needed to be done. The Torah was ready to be received and brought to the entire world. But God Almighty had even greater plans in mind. And we start to see that Joseph, the second youngest of Jacob's sons, starts describing dreams that he had about his eventual greatness, which was mocked by his brothers. So let's dig in over here in chapter 37 of the book of Genesis. Excuse me, Parshas Vayeshev. And it says that Yaakov is now sitting, he's dwelling, he's settled in the land of the region where his father had lived, in Canaan, which is in the city of Hebron, in that area. And we see that Joseph was someone that his father Jacob loved him more than all the other brothers. And the reason is because Jacob perceived that it was Joseph who had the possibility, Yosef, who had the possibility of actually being able to bring that complete refinement and channel to be able to harness the energy of Esav. And we see that Joseph was being, he was not he was not popular among his brothers, and even because his father's loving him more was actually provoking some jealousy. And also we see over here in verse 5 that he started to have these dreams, and he starts to tell everyone about these dreams. And he says, "We're here where they were in verse 7. There we were binding sheaves in the midst of the field when my sheaf stood up and remained upright, and your sheaves formed in a circle around my sheaf and prostrated themselves before it." And the brothers immediately understood that this meant that Joseph thought he was going to be a ruler over his brothers. And they challenged on them. So, would you really seek to reign over us? Would you really seek to rule over us? And they now hated him even more. So there's another dream. There was the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars prostrating themselves before me. So Jacob was bothered by the fact that he was revealing these dreams. And it says, his father, in verse 10, his father chided him. "What nonsense is this dream that you had? Will I, your mother, and your brothers indeed come and prostrate themselves on the ground before you?" But the brothers were still very bothered, and they remained jealous of him. And his father, however, Shamar Zadavar, his father was in verse 11, see over here, he guarded the matter. He knew that this was going to come to be. He just felt it was not something that Joseph should be talking about. So we have a whole situation here now where Jacob goes after sends Joseph to look after where his brothers are at and in shepherding the flocks and so forth. And comes a tremendous scheme that the brothers plot to kill him. And then Reuven says, no, not to kill him at all. Just put him in the pit. But don't actually take an active act to kill him. Now, Reuven's intention was that if once they put Joseph in the pit, that Reuven, would be able to come around and rescue Joseph from the pit and save him from this plot. But Reuven was in the middle of doing tshuva. He was fasting, and he was absent. He thought that Joseph would be left in the pit. And what happens is that the other brothers decide to sell Joseph in verse 25, to sell him. It was a caravan of Ishmaelim, descendants of Ishmael, coming, and they were traveling, and they're going down to Egypt. So they decide that they're going to sell him, and they sell him to this caravan as a slave. And so and then he was sold from the Ishmaelites to Midianites. The next day, Reuven comes back and sees that Joseph is not, and he was very, very distraught in verse 29. He says, "What, the boy is gone? We can't, his father's going to be so upset, such grief." In verse 31, they took Joseph's robe and they slaughtered a young goat, and they dipped it in the goat's blood to try to create the appearance that a wild animal had attacked Joseph in this beautiful garment that his father had gifted him, as the multicolored garment, his robe. And then they went to the father. They sent to the father through an emissary. They said, "We found this. Please identify it. Is this your son's robe or not?" And the father was just devastated. Jacob was devastated. And he concluded that a wild beast had devoured him and Joseph had been torn to pieces. But even though he came to that conclusion based on the evidence that was presented to him, he still was not mollified. When a person passes away, the close relatives, they mourn a person for a certain period of time, and after a year, after 7 days, and 30 days, and 1 year, the intensity of the mourning decreases. But it did not decrease for Jacob, because that's usually a sign that the person is not really dead. He in a certain sense, he was aware that Joseph was still alive, even though he saw the evidence that he was dead based on his coat and so forth. But he was not able to come to a place of rest and serenity. Now, in chapter 38, we take a digression, but a parallel here. This was something that the brothers, their strife among them, actually wasn't solved by the absence of Joseph. On the contrary, it increased because they saw their father's grief, and it was whose idea was to sell Joseph into slavery. It was Yehuda, one of the older brothers. So he stepped down from his position of leadership over his brothers, and he moved away from them. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 38, he went into a business partnership with a man from Adulam by the name of Chira. And he found a wife, and they had a son, Er, and then to another son, Einan. And then if you continue, verse 5, he had another son, Shelah. And so Yehuda, this is the year 2224, took a wife for Er, who was his firstborn son, took a wife for him. And her name was Tamar. Tamar was the daughter of Shem, who was one of the children of Noah that survived the flood. And so what happens here in verse 7 through 12 is we see that Tamar was very beautiful, and Er, Yehuda's firstborn, did evil in God's eyes, which is that he did not want to give his seed to Tamar because he was afraid that if she had children, that would mar her beauty. So he would have relations with her, but he would not let her have the seed. He would spill his seed deliberately. And the God Almighty's commandment to every single human being is that they have to be fruitful and multiply. And a person wasting seed is tantamount to murder, because they're not bringing the divine image into the world. So why is murder forbidden? Murder is forbidden because it's erasing the divine image from the world. And any act that prevents bringing the divine image into the world is itself tantamount to murder. So as a punishment, divine punishment, this heir was killed. God Almighty made him die as a result of this tremendous transgression of refusing to let children come into the world and wasting his seed. So now he gives his next son to this woman as a husband, Einan. And he says, marry your brother's wife, and you'll fulfill the duty of the brother of the deceased husband to her. Meaning to say, there's a concept called yibum, that if a man passes away and he has no children, then one of his brothers will marry his widow, and from there his lineage could be continued. So it'll be like producing offspring for your brother, like it says over here in verse 8. So Einan did not want to do this because then the offspring would not be his. So he also let his seed go to waste on the ground, so not to produce offspring for his brother. And so even though the motivation was different, the first one wanted to preserve the beauty of his wife, as he thought it, even though many people will testify that a woman bearing children actually makes her more beautiful. But that was the crooked thinking of the first brother. And the second brother had a different motivation, which was that he didn't want to have his seed go to his brother's widow, which would then lead those children to be kind of establishing a family for his brother. But even though the motivation was different, since the end result was different, that they both wasted their seed, then he also, what he did was evil in the eyes of God, and God made him also die. So now he should have married this woman, Tamar, should have married the next son in line, but Yehuda was getting, didn't want his third son to die. So he said, you have to wait till this boy grows up, and she went to live in her father's house. And then she realized that the time was not coming, that she was being given this younger son of Yehuda as in marriage. So she realized something was up, but she wanted to bear the offspring of Yehuda. And so when she found out that her father-in-law, Yehuda, was going up to Timnah to shear his flock, she took off her widow's garb and she concealed herself with a veil, and she sat at the crossroads and made herself look like she was available for prostitution. And Yehuda came and he didn't recognize her. His wife had passed away, and so he ends off entering into relations with her, and he didn't realize that it was his daughter-in-law. And so she says, she says, what are you going to use as payment? And he says he's going to send the goat from his flock, but she wanted security, so he gives her his signet ring and his cloak of a special status and the staff. And then they were together, and she conceived. And when he sent this goat to be sent his payment, they couldn't find her, and no one knew who she was, and no one knew what they were talking about when they were looking for her. So anyways, that was the end. That seemed like the end of the story. But all of a sudden, people realized that she's pregnant, and the problem was that she didn't have a husband. So it was considered she was guilty of being licentious. You see in verse 24 that she was pregnant, and that's a capital crime. But she knew who the father of this child was. It was Yehuda, but she didn't want to shame him. So she had the deposit that he had deposited with her, and the security for his payment. So she said, let whoever it is that these things belong to should acknowledge that this is his child that she's pregnant with. And so Yehuda recognized these. And even though it was something that was embarrassing for Yehuda to have to admit this, he acknowledged it publicly and then saved her from being executed. And then he actually married her. It says Yehuda married her. But it says she was never again intimate with her in the same, but not in the way from before, but actually properly married her at this time. Because at that point, it became clear that her sons had died not because of something wrong with her, but because of their own sins. And then she has two sons, twins, Peretz and Zerach, verses 27. And these are, Peretz is the progenitor of the Mashiach, of the Redeemer. And that is so it's interesting that the lineage of redemption comes through these things that, in the outset, a person would not have in any way condoned these activities, and yet at the same time, we see that from these challenges, if a person dedicates themselves into the service of God Almighty, instead of bemoaning their the problems of their childhood, or the problems of how they came to be conceived, or their difficulties and challenges in their relationship, their parents' relationship, but rather dedicate themselves in the service of God Almighty, great things will come from them. And now in verse 39, we see that we now return to the story of Joseph in Egypt, and he's taken into Egypt, and Potiphar, who was one of the courtiers of Paro and a chief of his butchers, very prominent Egyptian, had bought him as a slave. And Joseph was extremely successful, and he managed the household for him, and everything was in Joseph's care. And he caught the eye of his master's wife, who tried to seduce him, and he refused to be seduced by her. They were up to chapter 39, verse 8. He continued to refuse, and he protested that it would not be right because his master was trusting him with everything in the house except his wife, except the master's wife. He said, how could he commit such a sin as betraying his trust and also sin before God? Because adultery is prohibited to all of humanity, and this would be an act of adultery. So she continued persisting, and then one day he came to the house to do work, and everyone else was out celebrating some sort of holiday, idolatrous holiday, and he didn't participate in that because he was a son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the house was empty, and she caught hold of his garment and started to try to persuade him to, it's like she said, sleep with me. Here in verse 12, that he should lie with her. But he fled, leaving his garment in her hand. And then when she saw that she fled, she then took revenge on him for having rejected her. So then she started calling out that he tried to take advantage of her, and that he was trying to attack her. And she told this to her husband, and even though the husband, Potiphar, found it hard to believe, and it was difficult for him to punish him because Joseph was doing such a good job managing the house. But he came to believe what she was saying, and he threw him in the jail, because one of his other responsibility was he was the king's prisoners. He was like the prison warden. So now Joseph is in the prison. He becomes successful there, and he became like the manager of the prison for the warden. So then we see in chapter 40, this kind of pivotal moment when there's people in prison who have these dreams. We see that there was the cupbearer, the wine steward, who would hold the cup of the king, of Paro, and there was the king's baker. And one was being punished because a fly was found in the wine cup of the king, Paro, and the baker was in prison because there was a stone in the bread. And both of these show lack of attention, proper attention that a person should provide to his king, to make sure that the cup is supposed to be free of bugs and the bread should be free of stones. Because when you grind the wheat, little tiny stones can get into the wheat. So then Joseph comes in, and there's many, many beautiful lessons we can see over here. Joseph, in the morning, he sees that these two men had dreams, and each dream wasn't understandable to him because it was predicting their colleague's fate. When he comes into the room and he sees that they're very down, they're very troubled by these dreams. So why are you down today? It shows you the power of asking somebody, how are you doing? What's wrong? I see that you're down today. And that opened them up to describe to him that they had a dream. There's no one to interpret it. And Joseph says humbly, surely interpretations belong to God. Verse 8, please tell me your dreams. So the cupbearer tells his dream to Joseph. It was a vine, there are 3 branches, and it blossomed, and the clusters ripened to grapes, and Paro's cup was in my hand. They took the grapes, squeezed the juice into Paro's cup, then he placed the cup in Paro's hand. So Joseph said this means 3 days. 3 branches are 3 days. And it's going to be Paro's birthday, and he's going to take account of you when he summons all his servants. And you're going to be restored to your position. And this, you're going to place your cup in his hands, just as you'd used to before you were in prison when you served him his drinks. And then he says to him, so then you're going to be like an important person in the court again. And please keep me in mind when these things go well for you. And please do me the kindness of mentioning me to Paro. And thus you'll get me out of this prison. Because he says, for in fact, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and here too I did nothing to warrant him in putting in this dungeon. So now the baker sees that, because he dreamt the answer. He'd also dreamt the answer, so he knew the correct interpretation. He's like, wow, this guy really knows the interpretation. So he said, yeah. Now he tells Joseph his dream. So there's 3 wicker baskets on his head. One on the top was all the baked goods that Paro eats, and birds were eating from them in the back and from the basket above my head. So Joseph says this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets symbolize 3 days. In 3 days' time, Paro is going to decapitate him and hang his corpse on a gallows, and the birds will eat his flesh. So this is exactly what happened. On the 3rd day, which is Paro's birthday, he held a feast for all his servants, and these 2 people were called forward. And the cupbearer was restored to serving drinks, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, and the chief baker was hung, just as Joseph had interpreted the dream for them. So now we're left in suspense because the chief cupbearer completely forgets about Joseph, and he forgot about didn't remember on that day, forgot about him completely. And we see over here that Joseph put too much. A couple things happened. One is he got what got him like in the situation with the enticement and the entrapment with Potiphar's wife was that he started to twirl his hair and get very much into his own. He was a handsome young man, and he was very into his beauty and perception of himself as a handsome young man. So God Almighty sent Potiphar's wife to grab him, and that led him into a greater descent. And then once he was in that greater descent, now he's in prison. What led him to staying there was that he put too much faith in this cupbearer. He asked him, he was thinking that it's going to be up to the cupbearer to remember him and make a case for him in front of Paro, and he forgot that it's really in God's hand. And so he was thinking that the solution is the cupbearer's advocacy rather than God Almighty's mercy. And so he wasn't really ready to come out of prison yet. He still had this flaw of this judgment, this error of judgment, and this character flaw. So instead of taking 3 days for him to be released, it ended up to be 3 years later. And so we're going to see that it ends up only being 2 years, because the first 3 days he waited are counted as a complete year. That's the Paro's birthday. And then 2 years later, we're going to see he gets taken out of prison. But it shows us the importance. We're learning that in the book of the chapter, the book on the treatise on faith from the base of Levi, important and trusting in God Almighty, that when we need something, when we see that we need something to change in our lives, we're not looking for someone else to intercede on our behalf. We're looking for God's Almighty's mercy. It may be that there's an excuse for that mercy to be delivered through someone's intercession or someone's advocacy, but the real answer is coming from God Almighty's mercy. And so we see here the building up of this incredible crescendo of Joseph. So everything looks at the beginning of the Parsha like everything's fine, everything's ready for the ultimate redemption. But it turns out we're not really ready at that point in time. There's got to be this greater descent into Egypt. This building of this family has a lot of complexities to it, as we could see, because this family is going to have, when Jacob goes down into the land of Egypt, he's going to have 70 souls with him that are his immediate family. And those 70 souls correspond to the 70 nations. And so really we're building up the ability and the strength of character to be able that each one of these descendants should be capable of being a light unto the nations. So we were going from a place where we had Abraham, our father, one person, Isaac, our father, Jacob, our father, one person in each generation, till we're going to get to the 70 people in the generation, which is going to translate then into tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of their descendants who are, each one has the strength of character and the ability to go out and to provide the spiritual guidance to the world, be the light into the nations, to provide the example to the world on how we are meant to proclaim God Almighty in the world, in our lives, that this is a world of abundance. This is a world, this is a safe world. It's inherently a safe world because God Almighty is creating it for us, for our benefit. And his intention is that we should be able to thrive in it. That's God Almighty's intention. And it's meant to be us to thrive in it with greater and greater quantities and number of human beings, of great, wonderful human beings. This is the message of the Torah, the message, God Almighty's message to the entire world. And it's our job of the Jewish people to bring that message to the entire world, to encourage everyone in the entire world to know that there's enough in the world and that any apparent lack is only illusory, that there is absolute abundance in the world because God Almighty is the God of abundance. And he will create new resources. He will bring into the forefront of our awareness and into existence even new resources that will be available to provide for and to flourish and bring abundance to the entire human population, that as it grows from 8 billion to 80 billion and beyond, that this is the message that of hope that God Almighty has brought the Jewish people to the stewardship of that message. And that's what's happening here in this Parsha. This Parsha is about creating this dynamic and the family, the strength of character of each one of these sons of Jacob, which will then lead to the 70, their descendants, all 70 of them corresponding to the 70 nations and bringing goodness and abundance to the entire world. So God Almighty should bless you. Any questions? Let's check the chat. Okay. So God bless you all, and we'll continue with next week's Parsha next week. Thank you so much. God bless you all.